When did you truly think you were about to die? My friend Lydia begged me to go to her comedy show because her YouTube stalker had been sending increasingly unhinged messages, and she was scared to be out alone. This guy Brad was obsessed with her, commenting on every video about how they were meant to be together and sending her pictures of dead pigeons that he said were his sacrifices for her. We had dinner before her show, and Lydia kept checking over her shoulder, showing me his latest messages about how beautiful she looked in yesterday's video, how he could hear her voice whispering to him when he touched himself. I told her I'd be with her the whole night, but she couldn't relax, barely touching her food. During the show, she killed it on stage, but I could see her scanning the audience between jokes, looking for him. Nothing happened, though, and by the time we left the venue at 11, she was saying maybe she'd been paranoid for nothing. We had no idea what was in store for us. The parking garage was across the street, one of those concrete structures with flickering lights and no security after 10. We took the elevator to the 4th floor where we'd parked, the doors opening to a completely empty level, just rows of concrete pillars and shadows. Our footsteps echoed as we walked toward her car at the far end, and I made a joke about horror movies that made Lydia nervous laugh. We were halfway there when we heard whistling behind us, some slow melody that bounced off the walls, making it impossible to tell where it was coming from. Lydia grabbed my arm hard enough to hurt and walked faster, but the whistling got louder, closer, and then stopped completely, which was somehow worse. A man stepped out from behind a pillar 20 feet away, tall and skinny in a hoodie, holding his phone up, recording us. "Lydia!" he called out, his voice cracking with excitement. "It's me, Brad, from your comments." "I've been waiting for you." Lydia was trembling against me, and I stepped in front of her, telling him to back off, but he kept walking toward us with the phone raised. "You look even prettier in person," he said. "I knew you'd come here. You parked here in your video from 2 months ago. I've been waiting every night." My heart was pounding as we backed toward her car, but he followed, getting closer, saying how he'd watched every video hundreds of times, how he knew everything about her, her coffee order, her gym schedule, her sister's name. Lydia was crying and fumbling for her keys while I kept myself between them, but he was getting more agitated that she wouldn't talk to him. "I've supported you since the beginning," he screamed. 3 years. I deserve this." He lunged forward and I shoved him back hard, making him drop his phone, and it shattered on the concrete. His face went from desperate to furious, and he pulled something from his pocket that flashed silver in the dim light. "You're going to talk to me," he said, his voice different now, darker, controlled. We reached Lydia's car and she clicked the unlock button, but nothing happened. She tried again, pressing it frantically, but the lights didn't flash and the doors stayed locked. Brad was 10 feet away now, and I could see it was a knife in his hand, one of those hunting knives with a serrated edge. Lydia tried her physical key, but it wouldn't turn, like something was jammed in the lock. She was hyperventilating, pulling at the door handle desperately. Brad laughed and held up something in his other hand, a small device with a blinking red light saying, "Signal jammer," and superglue in the locks. "We're going to have that conversation now." He moved closer and we backed against the car with nowhere to go. The garage was empty, no cameras, no help, just concrete and shadows, and this man who'd been studying Lydia's life for months. My mouth was completely dry, and I could feel sweat running down my back despite the cold garage air. He pressed the knife tip against the car window, dragging it along the glass with a horrible screech, saying, "I've been so patient, so understanding, but you never even acknowledged me. Not one reply in 3 years." Lydia was sobbing, and I tried to call 911 but had no signal, the jammer killing our phones completely. Brad smiled at this and said, "It's just us now. Finally, the way it should be." I tried to think of something, anything, but my mind was blank with panic. He grabbed Lydia's wrist and yanked her toward him, and she screamed, the sound echoing through the empty garage, bouncing off concrete walls, but there was no one to hear. I grabbed his arm trying to pull his hand off, but he slashed at me with the knife, catching my palm, the blade going deep, blood immediately running down my arm and dripping onto the concrete. The pain was sharp and hot and made me dizzy. He had Lydia pressed against the car now, the knife at her throat, whispering how they were meant to be together, how he'd make her understand, how he'd prepared everything for this moment. She was trying to turn her head away, but he grabbed her chin, forcing her to look at him, and I could see a thin line of blood where the knife was pressing into her neck. I grabbed his wrist, holding the knife with my good hand, but he was stronger than he looked, wiry muscles under the hoodie, and the blade was getting closer to her skin, already drawing more blood. My injured hand was useless, throbbing and slippery with blood, and I could feel myself getting weaker. We were trapped between him and the dead car, no phones, no help. My grip on his wrist was getting weaker by the second, and blood from my cut hand was making everything slippery. The knife edge pressed harder against Lydia's throat, and I could see the thin red line getting longer, her eyes huge with terror as she tried to pull away but couldn't move. Brad was pushing forward with all his weight, and my arm was shaking from the strain, knowing I had maybe 5 seconds before he overpowered me completely. Without thinking, I brought my knee up as hard as I could into his groin, and he made this awful gasping sound, doubling over just enough for his grip to loosen. Lydia twisted away from the knife and stumbled backward while I grabbed Brad's hoodie and pulled him down with me, both of us hitting the concrete hard enough to knock the wind out of me. The knife went flying across the garage floor with a metallic scraping sound, and Brad immediately tried to scramble after it, but I grabbed his leg and yanked him back. We rolled across the cold concrete, him trying to get on top of me while I used my legs to keep him off, my cut hand completely useless now, just throbbing and weak. Brad was stronger than he looked, all wiry muscle under that hoodie, and he managed to get his hands around my throat for a second before I bucked him off. The knife was maybe 10 feet away, and we both saw Lydia running for it at the same time. She grabbed it before Brad could reach it and backed away, holding it with both hands shaking, so bad I thought she might drop it. Brad froze when he saw her with his weapon, and his face went from rage to total confusion, like his brain couldn't process this reversal, like in his fantasy she was never supposed to fight back. He started to stand up, but I managed to get behind him and wrapped my good arm around his neck, locking it in place with my other arm, even though my injured hand screamed in pain. Brad clawed at my arm and tried to throw me off, thrashing around like crazy, but I held on knowing if I let go we were both dead. He was making these choking sounds, and his fingernails were digging into my forearm, drawing blood, but I squeezed harder, using my legs to keep him from getting leverage to flip me. It felt like forever, but was probably only 30 seconds before his struggles started getting weaker, and then he went completely limp in my arms. I held on for another few seconds just to be sure he was really out before letting him drop to the concrete. My whole body was shaking, and I could barely stand, having to use the car to pull myself up and leaving bloody handprints all over the white paint. Lydia dropped the knife like it burned her and ran over to help me, both of us looking back at Brad, who was sprawled on the concrete, but already starting to groan and move a little. We stumbled toward the stairwell as fast as we could, because the elevator might trap us if he woke up and caught us in there. Brad was making more noise behind us now, starting to come around, and we moved faster, even though my legs felt like jelly and Lydia was crying so hard she could barely see. The stairwell door was heavy, and I had to lean my whole body weight against it to push it open. As soon as we got through, Lydia pulled out her phone and started pressing buttons, finally getting a signal now that we were away from that jammer thing Brad had. She called 911, and her voice was high and shaky as she told them we were in the parking garage across from the comedy club, and someone had attacked us with a knife. I leaned against the wall, trying not to pass out from the pain in my hand and the exhaustion hitting me all at once, keeping my back pressed against the door in case Brad tried to follow us. The operator was asking Lydia questions and telling her to stay on the line while they sent units, and I could hear her trying to explain about the stalker and the knife and my hand being cut. Through the door, we could hear Brad yelling now, his voice echoing in the garage, screaming Lydia's name over and over and saying she'd regret this, that they were meant to be together, that she was making a mistake. But he didn't try to come through the door, probably still too dizzy from being choked out, or maybe he was looking for his knife. The operator kept Lydia talking, asking about our injuries and exact location, and I pressed harder against the door even though Brad hadn't tried to open it yet. My hand was dripping blood on the stairwell floor, and I was getting lightheaded, but I kept my weight against that door. Then we heard the sirens, quiet at first, but getting louder fast, and the operator said units were pulling into the garage right now. The sirens echoed through the concrete structure, and we could hear car doors slamming and radios crackling and voices shouting commands. 2 officers found us in the stairwell within maybe a minute, one of them immediately calling for paramedics when he saw all the blood, while the other one got on his radio saying they had 2 victims secure and needed backup on the 4th floor. They asked where Brad was, and Lydia pointed up, saying he was still in the garage with the knife somewhere, and 3 more officers rushed past us heading up the stairs with their hands on their weapons. We could hear them shouting at Brad to get on the ground, then some scuffling sounds, and finally one of them radioed that they had the suspect in custody. The paramedic came up the stairs a minute later and took one look at my hand before pulling out a roll of gauze and telling me to sit down on the concrete steps. She wrapped it tight, while Lydia stood next to the officers telling them everything that happened, her voice steady even though I could see dried blood on her neck from where Brad's knife had pressed. They brought Brad down the stairs in handcuffs, and he kept his head down, not looking at either of us as they loaded him into the back of a patrol car. The paramedic said I needed stitches and probably surgery based on how deep the cut was, and they loaded us both into an ambulance even though Lydia said she was fine. At the hospital, they put us in beds next to each other in the emergency room, and a doctor named Grayson Wyatt came in to look at my hand, moving my fingers around and shaking his head. He numbed it with a shot that hurt worse than the cut itself, and started stitching while explaining that the knife had hit some nerves and I'd need surgery to fix the damage properly. Lydia sat on the bed next to mine, getting her neck cleaned and bandaged by a nurse, both of us not saying much, just sitting there processing what had happened. Detective Selena Rios showed up about an hour later with her phone out to record our statements, pulling a chair between our beds and asking us to start from the beginning. She was patient when we had to stop a few times, especially when Lydia started crying again, talking about Brad holding the knife to her throat, and she gave us water and tissues and said we could take as many breaks as we needed. After we finished telling her everything, Selena explained the charges they were filing against Brad, counting them off on her fingers as assault with a deadly weapon, false imprisonment, and stalking. She said the signal jammer and superglue in the locks showed clear planning that would make the charges stick hard in court. Lydia called her brother Jace from the hospital phone, since our cells were still dead from that jammer thing, and I could hear him yelling through the receiver before she even finished explaining what happened. He said he was driving up from his city right away, that he'd be there in 3 hours, and when he showed up he was mad as hell, but focused on taking care of Lydia, saying he'd stay as long as she needed him. The next day, Selena picked us up to go back to the garage to get Lydia's car, which still had the superglue jammed in all the locks. The crime scene tape was wrapped around a section of the 4th floor, and there were still bloodstains on the concrete that made my stomach turn, mine and Lydia's mixed together in dark spots. A locksmith had to drill out all the locks and replace them, while we stood there trying not to look at the tape or the blood, and we left as soon as the car was working again. Pierre LeBlanc called Lydia's phone that afternoon to check on her, saying he'd heard what happened from one of the cops who came by the club asking questions. He kept saying how horrible it was, and that he wanted to help, offering to pay for security guards at all her future shows so she'd feel safe performing again. 3 days after the attack, we had to go to the courthouse for Brad's arraignment, sitting in the back row while his public defender Rex Gibbs stood next to him at the defendant's table. Brad pleaded not guilty to all charges, even though we'd literally caught him with the knife, and the judge set his bail at $200,000 with a no-contact order if he somehow posted it. After court, a woman named Kira Nicholson from Victim Services found us in the hallway and brought us to a small office to explain how everything would work going forward. She helped Lydia fill out paperwork for a restraining order and gave her a folder full of information about counseling services and support groups for stalking victims. Kira was calm and organized, walking us through each step of what would happen with the criminal case and making sure we understood our rights as victims. My hand surgery got scheduled for the following week, and the surgeon warned me during the consultation that I might not get full feeling back in my fingers because of how the nerve damage looked on the scans. The bills were already starting to come in, hundreds of dollars even after insurance, and I tried not to think about how much the surgery itself would cost. Lydia stayed with Jace at his hotel that whole week, too scared to go back to her apartment alone, jumping every time someone knocked on the door or walked too close behind us on the street. The surgery took 4 hours, and they had to put pins in to hold everything together. While the nerves tried to heal, and I woke up with my whole hand wrapped in this huge bandage that made it look like I was wearing a boxing glove. 2 days later, Kira called with news that made my stomach drop, telling me Brad's parents posted bail using their house as collateral. She tried to sound reassuring about the monitoring anklet and restraining order keeping him away from us, but I could hear the concern in her voice when she said these things don't always work perfectly. Lydia completely fell apart when I told her, crying so hard she couldn't catch her breath, and Jace immediately started packing her stuff to move into his place that same afternoon. They spent the next day installing cameras at every entrance to his apartment building, running wires and mounting brackets while Lydia sat on the couch wrapped in a blanket. She jumped every time someone walked past the door, checking the locks over and over, even though Jace kept telling her she was safe. The cameras had night vision and motion alerts that went straight to both their phones, but she still couldn't sleep, spending nights staring at the feeds on her laptop. My physical therapy started that week in a small clinic that smelled like rubber and cleaning products. The therapist showed me exercises with rubber bands and foam balls, making me squeeze and stretch my fingers, even though every movement sent sharp pains up my arm. She kept saying I was lucky the nerve damage wasn't worse, but lucky felt like the wrong word when I couldn't even hold a coffee cup without shaking. The exercises were supposed to rebuild strength and flexibility, but progress was so slow, I could barely tell anything was changing. 3 weeks after Brad got out, we met with prosecutor Natalia Bergman in her office downtown. She had files spread across her desk and walked us through how the trial would work, explaining she was confident about getting a conviction based on the evidence. She warned us that Rex Gibbs would try to minimize what Brad did, probably arguing it was just romantic obsession that went too far, not real criminal intent. Natalia said juries sometimes buy into that story if they don't understand how dangerous stalking really is, so we'd need to be clear about the fear and planning involved. Meanwhile, someone posted about the attack on a YouTube drama channel, and Lydia's comments section exploded overnight. Most people were supportive, sending messages about staying strong and calling Brad a monster, but some idiots actually blamed her for leading him on by being friendly in her videos. They said she should have known better than to smile so much or share personal stories if she didn't want attention, which made me so mad I had to stop reading. Lydia deleted the YouTube app from her phone, but the comments kept coming, hundreds every hour. Pierre called a few days later saying he'd arranged for Lydia to perform again at a smaller venue with extra security. He'd hired 2 guards and installed metal detectors at the doors, promising everything would be safe and controlled. Lydia was nervous, but determined not to let Brad take comedy away from her, practicing her set in Jace's living room while he pretended to be the audience. The night of the show, we got there early to check all the exits and meet the security guards. The metal detectors beeped constantly as people arrived, and the guards checked bags and patted down anyone who set them off. Lydia went on stage looking confident, starting strong with jokes about online dating and weird roommates. But halfway through her set, she suddenly stopped mid-sentence, staring at someone in the back row. Her face went white and she took a step backward, the microphone shaking in her hand. It was just some tall guy in a hoodie who looked vaguely like Brad from a distance, but she couldn't recover, stumbling through 2 more jokes before walking off stage 5 minutes early. She was embarrassed and angry at herself, but I told her it was completely normal to see him everywhere after what happened. Rex Gibbs filed a motion the next week, claiming Brad had mental health issues that affected his judgment during the attack. The paperwork said he'd been diagnosed with something called delusional disorder and couldn't understand that Lydia didn't actually want a relationship with him. Natalia called us right away, explaining this was a common defense tactic that almost never works because mental illness doesn't eliminate criminal responsibility. She said even if Brad genuinely believed Lydia loved him, he still chose to buy a knife, jam the locks, and attack us, which showed he knew what he was doing was wrong. I went back to work with my hand still wrapped in bandages, trying to type reports with basically 1.5 hands. Every email took forever, and I kept making mistakes, hitting wrong keys or dropping things when I forgot I couldn't grip properly. My boss was understanding, saying to take whatever time I needed, but I could feel my performance slipping and worried about keeping my job if this lasted much longer. The physical therapy was helping slowly, but I still couldn't make a fist or hold anything heavier than a pencil without pain shooting through my palm. Then 3 weeks before the trial was supposed to start, Lydia got a letter at Jace's apartment with no return address. Inside was a handwritten note from Brad, passed through some third party to get around the restraining order. He apologized for scaring her, but said she'd misunderstood his intentions, that everything he did was out of love and she'd realize that someday. The letter went on for 3 pages about their destiny together and how the trial was just a misunderstanding that would get sorted out. Selena came to pick up the letter as evidence, saying she'd immediately report this to the court since it was a clear violation of the no-contact order. She looked tired and frustrated, mentioning that Brad's parents had been calling the station, claiming their son was persecuted for being in love. The next morning, Natalia called to say she'd filed an emergency motion about the letter, and the judge wanted to see us that afternoon. We drove to the courthouse and waited outside the courtroom, while Brad's parents sat across from us, his mother crying into tissues. The bailiff called us in, and Brad was already there in an orange jumpsuit, looking thinner than before, with dark circles under his eyes. The judge read the letter out loud, his voice getting harder with each line about destiny and misunderstandings. He looked at Brad and asked if he understood what a restraining order meant. Brad started talking about how Lydia had smiled at him in a video once, proving she wanted him to reach out. The judge cut him off and revoked his bail right there, ordering him back to county jail until trial. Brad's mother sobbed louder as they led him away in shackles, and he kept looking back at Lydia with this weird smile. We walked out feeling safer, but Lydia still made me check her car before she got in. That night at Jace's apartment, she installed 2 more deadbolts on the door, even though Brad was locked up. She couldn't sleep without checking the locks every hour, getting up to test each one and peek through the blinds. Kira gave us the name of a therapist who worked with stalking victims, and Lydia made an appointment for the next week. The therapist's office was in a secure building with a doorman and cameras everywhere, which helped Lydia relax enough to talk. She met with the therapist twice a week, learning breathing exercises and ways to manage the constant fear. The therapist explained that checking locks was normal after trauma, but they worked on reducing it gradually. Meanwhile, my hand was getting better, and the surgeon said I could remove the bandages after 6 weeks. When the nurse unwrapped it, the scar was thick and pink, running diagonal across my palm like someone had drawn on it with a marker. I could bend my fingers now, but couldn't make a tight fist, and gripping things still hurt. The surgeon tested my strength and sensation, saying I'd gotten back about 70% function, which was better than he'd expected. Physical therapy helped, but the therapist warned I'd probably never get full strength back in that hand. 2 months before trial, Natalia met with us at her office to discuss a possible plea deal. She said she'd offered Brad 5 years in prison if he admitted guilt to all charges. Rex Gibbs had presented it to Brad, but warned us he was being difficult about accepting any responsibility. Natalia thought Brad might take it to avoid the risk of a longer sentence at trial, but she wasn't holding her breath. While we waited for Brad's decision, Lydia slowly started making YouTube videos again from Jace's apartment. She filmed in a corner with no windows or identifying features, just a plain white wall behind her. Every video was recorded in one take because she was too nervous to edit, afraid of spending hours looking at herself on screen. She turned off all comments and set up a post office box 3 towns over for any fan mail. Her subscriber count actually went up after local news covered the attack, which made her feel weird about the whole thing. Pierre called to book her at a bigger venue, saying people wanted to support her after what she'd been through. The new place held 500 people and sold out in 2 days, but Lydia felt conflicted about profiting from trauma. She needed the money, though, since she'd been too scared to work her day job, calling in sick for weeks. Pierre hired 3 security guards for the show and had them check everyone's ID at the door. During the show, Lydia killed it, turning her fear into comedy that had everyone laughing and crying. She didn't mention Brad directly, but talked about dating and trust in ways that hit different now. 3 weeks before trial, we had to go to a pre-trial hearing about evidence and witnesses. Brad sat at the defense table staring at Lydia the entire time, not even pretending to look away. His eyes followed her every movement, tracking when she shifted in her seat or tucked her hair behind her ear. The judge noticed and told Brad twice to face forward, but he'd turn back to stare within seconds. Finally, the judge threatened to remove him from the courtroom if he didn't stop, and Rex Gibbs had to physically turn Brad's chair away from us. After the hearing, Kira met with us to prepare victim impact statements for sentencing. She gave us worksheets with questions about how the attack affected our daily lives, our work, our relationships. Writing it all down was harder than I expected, seeing the list of ways Brad had changed everything. My hand cramped up trying to write with a pen, so I had to type one-handed on Kira's laptop. Lydia broke down twice trying to describe her fear, having to take breaks to walk around the building. Kira said these statements would help the judge understand the real impact during sentencing if Brad got convicted. The next week, Natalia called with frustrating news about the plea deal. Brad had rejected it completely, insisting on going to trial because he believed Lydia would forgive him once she heard his side. Rex Gibbs had tried to convince him, but Brad was certain a jury would understand true love. Natalia said this happened sometimes with stalkers who couldn't accept reality, but it meant we'd definitely be going to trial. Jury selection started the following Monday with Natalia carefully questioning potential jurors. She asked about their views on relationships, boundaries, and whether they'd ever felt unsafe. Anyone who called Brad's behavior romantic got dismissed immediately by Natalia using her challenges. She wanted jurors who understood that stalking was about control and possession, not love or romance. The process took 3 days with Natalia and Rex Gibbs arguing over every potential juror. On Thursday morning, the judge selected 12 jurors plus 2 alternates, and we knew the trial would start Monday. That weekend passed in a blur of prep sessions with Natalia going over our testimony one more time. Monday morning, we arrived at the courthouse to find metal detectors set up at the courtroom entrance with 3 court officers checking everyone who entered. Brad's parents were already seated in the second row behind the defense table, both of them looking older and smaller than when I'd seen them at the arraignment. His mother kept dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, while his father stared straight ahead at nothing. Brad came in wearing a suit that looked too big for him, his wrists in handcuffs until the officers removed them at the defense table. He immediately turned to scan the gallery until he found Lydia, his eyes locking onto her and not looking away. The judge came in and everyone stood. Then opening statements began with Natalia walking the jury through what the evidence would show. She explained the months of messages, the planning with the signal jammer and superglue, and finally the attack itself. Rex Gibbs tried to paint Brad as a lonely young man whose feelings got out of control, suggesting Lydia had encouraged his attention by being friendly in her videos. After lunch, Natalia called Lydia as her first witness, and she walked to the stand with her hands shaking slightly. The clerk swore her in, and Natalia started with easy questions about her YouTube channel and comedy career. Then she moved into the stalking, having Lydia read some of Brad's messages out loud to the jury. Lydia's voice cracked reading one where Brad described watching her through her apartment window. She talked about the fear, checking over her shoulder constantly, changing her routines to avoid being predictable. When Natalia asked about the night of the attack, Lydia had to pause several times to compose herself. She described hearing the whistling in the garage, seeing Brad step out with his phone, the terror when she realized the car locks were glued shut. Rex Gibbs cross-examined her, suggesting she could have blocked Brad online or made her videos private. He asked if she'd ever thanked Brad for his support or liked any of his comments, trying to make it seem like she'd led him on. Lydia stayed calm, explaining she'd never responded to him directly, and that creators couldn't control who watched their content. The next morning I took the stand, my scarred hand visible as I raised it for the oath. Natalia had me describe arriving at the garage, the confrontation, and Brad pulling the knife. I showed the jury my palm where the scar ran from my thumb to my pinky, still pink and raised after months of healing. Natalia put up photos on a screen showing the blood on the concrete, my hand wrapped in bloody gauze at the hospital, the knife recovered at the scene. The jurors looked sick seeing the amount of blood, one woman covering her mouth with her hand. Rex Gibbs asked if I'd been drinking that night, if maybe I'd escalated things by shoving Brad first. I explained Brad had lunged at us with a weapon, and I'd defended us, nothing more. Wednesday afternoon, Rex Gibbs called Brad to testify despite clearly not wanting to. Brad took the stand eagerly, leaning toward the microphone like he'd been waiting for this moment. He started rambling about destiny, how he and Lydia were meant to be together, how her videos were secret messages just for him. He insisted the knife was just for protection, that he'd never really hurt Lydia, that I was the violent one for attacking him. The prosecutor barely had to cross-examine him because Brad kept talking, digging himself deeper with every word. He told the jury Lydia would forgive him once she understood his love, that 3 years of devotion meant something, that they'd be together eventually. The judge had to tell him several times to just answer the questions asked. Thursday morning, both sides gave closing arguments, Natalia methodically laying out the evidence while Rex Gibbs made a weak plea for lesser charges. The judge gave the jury instructions, and they filed out to deliberate just before lunch. We waited in a conference room, Lydia pacing back and forth while I sat with my hand throbbing from the stress. 2 hours later, the clerk called us back because the jury had reached verdicts. They filed in without looking at Brad, which Natalia said was a good sign for us. The judge asked the foreman to read the verdicts, and he stood, paper shaking slightly in his hands. Guilty of assault with a deadly weapon, guilty of false imprisonment, guilty of stalking, guilty on every single charge. Brad jumped up shouting that Lydia would regret this, that she'd need him someday, that they were meant to be together. The officers grabbed him, wrestling him back into handcuffs while he kept screaming about true love and destiny. His mother sobbed while his father finally put his arm around her, both of them looking broken. The judge thanked the jury and set sentencing for 3 weeks later, remanding Brad back to custody. 3 weeks crawled by until the sentencing hearing arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning. The courtroom was less crowded this time, just us, Brad's parents, and a few reporters. Brad looked thinner in his orange jumpsuit, his hair grown out and greasy. The judge heard from Natalia about Brad's lack of remorse and continued obsession, then from Rex Gibbs about his client's mental health issues and previously clean record. The judge said he'd reviewed everything carefully, including our victim impact statements and the psychiatric evaluation. He sentenced Brad to 8 years in state prison with mandatory psychiatric treatment throughout his incarceration. He also extended the restraining order for 20 years following Brad's release, the maximum allowed by law. Brad stared at Lydia the entire time, not even reacting to the sentence. As the officers led him away, Lydia suddenly broke down completely, months of held-back emotion pouring out in huge, gasping sobs. Jace pulled her against him, holding her while she cried so hard she could barely breathe. We stayed in the courtroom for 20 minutes until she could walk, her face red and puffy, but somehow looking lighter. That Friday, Pierre closed his club to the public and invited everyone who'd supported us through the trial for dinner. Natalia came with her husband, Kira brought her partner, even Grayson stopped by after his hospital shift. We ate good food and drank wine, nobody really celebrating but just being together after something so hard. Pierre made a toast to survival and justice, though those words felt too big for what we'd been through. Over the next few months, Lydia slowly started performing again, first just 5-minute sets at open mics, then longer slots as her confidence rebuilt. She added material about the experience, turning the darkest moments into comedy that helped her process everything. The audiences connected with her honesty about fear and recovery, laughing and crying with her. My hand therapy continued twice a week, painful exercises to stretch the scar tissue and rebuild strength. The therapist said I'd reached about 85% function, which was better than initially expected, but meant I'd always have limitations. The scar would be there forever, a thick line across my palm that ached when it rained. 3 weeks later, Lydia called to say she'd found an apartment with good security on the 3rd floor of a building with cameras everywhere. Jace drove up to help her move in and spent the whole weekend installing extra locks and a doorbell camera that sent alerts to her phone. She signed up for self-defense classes at a gym downtown and went twice a week even when her schedule got busy. The instructor showed her how to break holds and where to hit to cause the most pain if someone grabbed her. I helped her practice the moves in her living room until they became automatic responses. She still jumped at unexpected sounds but refused to let fear control her life anymore. Her comedy sets got better as she worked through the trauma on stage, turning the darkest parts into jokes that made people laugh and cry. Pierre booked her for bigger venues, and she started selling out shows, her story connecting with audiences who'd been through their own scary stuff. 6 months after the attack, she headlined a 1,000-seat theater, the biggest show of her career. She stood on that huge stage and dedicated the performance to other stalking survivors, saying nobody should have to live in fear of someone who claims to love them. Half the ticket sales went to victim services to help people going through what we'd survived. The crowd gave her a standing ovation before she even told her first joke. I sat in the front row watching her own that stage, proud of how far she'd come from crying in that garage. Around that time, I met someone at physical therapy who was recovering from a car accident. She noticed my scar during exercises and asked about it without being pushy. We started talking during sessions, and she understood why loud noises made me tense up. She never got upset when I checked locks twice or wanted to the park near exits. We took things slow, but it felt good to connect with someone who got that trauma. Changes you. She came with me to Lydia's shows and they became friends too, bonding over recovery stories. Lydia's YouTube channel exploded after she posted a video about the stalking and trial. She gained 100,000 subscribers in a month, people drawn to her honesty about surviving something terrible. She was careful though, filming in neutral locations and never showing anything that could identify where she lived or worked. Comments stayed turned off, but she read emails from fans who shared their own stalking experiences. She made videos, responding to their questions about healing and setting boundaries with people who don't respect them. The channel became bigger than it ever was before Brad, proof that he hadn't destroyed what she'd built. One afternoon, Natalia called while I was at work to tell us Brad had been attacked by another inmate. He was in the medical wing for a week, then moved to protective custody permanently. She said this happens sometimes to guys who hurt women, that other prisoners had their own code about that stuff. Lydia and I talked about it over coffee and realized we felt nothing about the news. Not happy, not sad, just empty of any feelings about him at all. He'd taken up so much space in our heads for so long, but now he was just some guy in prison. We'd moved past needing updates about his life or caring what happened to him. The only thing that mattered was that he couldn't hurt us anymore. Lydia and I stayed close, checking in every few days even when life got busy. We had dinner once a week, sometimes with my girlfriend and Jace when he was in town. There was something about surviving that night together that bonded us deeper than regular friendship. She thanked me constantly for saving her life, but I knew she'd saved mine too by fighting back and staying strong. We never talked about that night directly anymore, but it was always there between us, this thing we'd survived together. Pierre called Lydia one day with huge news about a comedy special opportunity. A streaming service wanted to film her next show, drawn to her story of turning trauma into comedy that helped people heal. She called me crying happy tears, saying she couldn't believe something good was coming from something so awful. She accepted the deal and started working on new material, determined to show that victims could do more than just survive. The special would reach millions of people who might need to hear that they could get through their own dark times. We celebrated at Pierre's club with everyone who'd supported us through the trial and recovery. Looking at my scarred hand holding a champagne glass, I thought about how different life was now from that night in the garage. The scar would always be there, aching when weather changed, reminding me daily of what we'd survived. But we were both living fuller lives than before, working and laughing and connecting with people who understood our story. We refused to let one violent man define our futures or make us small with fear. We'd taken back our lives completely. Thanks for letting me wander through all this with you. Definitely been quite a journey to share together. Really appreciate you being here. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.